So welcome to Tuesday Devotion. And Dany and Bethany, welcome. We have Dany and Bethany joining us today to talk about the practice of silence. And if you guys could give us a little introduction to yourselves. I'm sure you know these two wonderful women already, but if you could just give us a little brief intro, that'd be great.
Yeah, I can go first. I'm Dany Lombardo. I'm a fourth year student in the International Studies program, and this year I am the president of the Student Association, also called TUSA.
I'm Bethany. I'm also in my fourth year. I study art and design, and this year I am the VP of Student Relations on TUSA, and we met Jen sometime last year, and I feel like you were the person who really introduced us to like the practice of silence too. So
you guys did they did a great series on spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines last year in TUSA, which was really awesome. And silence was one of those practices. And then I heard that over the summer, you guys had a chance to go on a silent retreat yourselves during the busyness of COVID. With all the changes coming, you both took time out to enter into an actual silent retreat. So tell me, what drew you to silence? What was that like?
I think that for me, what drew me to silence initially was like, because that was, I think, too, like what I was thinking about before we started the spiritual disciplines practice thing through TUSA last year. A friend and I were talking about, I think, kind of just the underlying anxiousness between everything that was happening and kind of constantly being overwhelmed and really being like distracted a lot of the time, and just kind of that like constant noise and sensing like a deep need for peace and to like slow down. And so I think that's like initially where that interest in silence began. And then Dany and I both lived alone on campus this summer, and even though we were spending so much time alone in solitude, I think I wasn't really experiencing silence in like a renewing way. Instead it was like an empty kind of silence, or I was like always seeking out people or like filling space with noise, and like providing distractions for myself. And so I think it was like this recognition that I needed to slow down, and I needed to experience God's peace more.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say similar to Bethany. It was kind of interesting that our environment was quiet because there wasn't a lot of people on campus during this summer, but it didn't feel that way internally. It felt like there was a lot of turmoil and like anxiety, and I think for me, just like leading up to the fall, like I had all this like anxiousness of like what was gonna happen and how we were gonna plan for COVID. And also just like my summer job was in social media, so it didn't feel like it was restful. Like I felt like I was like on all the time. And I think there's always like this conversation happening inside of us sometimes that we neglect when we don't have silence, that it's like there's so much going on inside, right? And I feel like I didn't have the space to actually listen to what was going on inside, so going away seemed like a really good idea. So we came desperately to you, Jen. We wrote an email, me and Bethany, late at night. We were like, Jen, help. And then you kindly suggested that we take a retreat and do the silence practice, and it was a great option and decision. And I think it's even the effects of that time have been felt throughout the semester.
And I think like in that time too, there's so much that we were like processing and trying to process afterwards, that I think we're like kind of seeing the lessons from that into like this semester, and reminding ourselves too of like the peace of that like retreat, and seeing like, oh, that is what we need and that's what we're craving, and so how do we carve out time for silence now and like time to slow down in the semester too.
Wow, that's so difficult when the semester gets going, isn't it? Richard Foster, he writes that we go away to practice silence so that we can start to practice silence in our everyday life. That we kind of go away and get practice there. And then we carry some of that with us. And I hear that, which is really cool. That, you know, you've experienced that. You carry some of that back with you. It's very cool. Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm just checking my little questions here.
It's all good.
Okay, thanks.
We have limited memory. We can always, you know, remember so much.
Okay. Thanks, Dany. Because what I'm wondering, because you've spoken to so many of these things, the importance of stepping away, and how it has impacted you now. I hear a lot of the difference. I'm going to go off our notes a little bit, because what I hear is the difference between an internal silence and an external silence. And how have you been able to cultivate that internal silence when you were away on retreat, but then also here in the midst of kind of back in the chaos and the noise? Is that...
Thinking through.
That's all right. Take your time, actually. That's part of,
Well, I think like part of that is, so in the now, like figuring out like rhythms that you can kind of set up in your life that are like quiet. So I know like we've talked about like that often is like through going on like walks by yourself, or I'm usually the first person awake in my house, and so it's usually like I'll make like a cup of coffee and just sit by myself before kind of any of the day gets going. So I think that like in the like present kind of chaos and busyness, that's like a helpful rhythm to just set up. But then I think that like the inner silence, and I think experiencing like that inner work sense, particularly during the retreat, was, I think it was interesting that there's so much kind of internally that's happening that is chaotic, and when you take time for silence, that all kind of comes to the surface, and so it takes a long time to settle. And so I think giving your space that like longer period of silence so that you can sit in that, and because I think it's easy in like shorter moments of silence to almost get frustrated with yourself of like there's so much going on and there's so much noise that you're kind of still distracted, but having that like longer period of silence to kind of let like the murkiness settle really, and then I think in that there's things that come up that you like have been ignoring or distracting yourself from, that then you can like begin to work through, and then I think that like carries into like your daily rhythms that you're establishing too, where you keep working through those things. I don't really know if that's what you're asking.
No, that's great. No, that's great. One of my friends, when I first began silent retreats, I was about to go on my first silent retreat, and she gave me this image of a stream and walking into like a murky stream that was filled, you know, all the mud and stuff floating through, and to walk into the stream in a silent retreat was like just standing still in the middle of the stream and letting everything settle. And then you can look down and see kind of what you were stubbing your toe on, or the rock that you kept bumping into, and that's the inner work. But like the inner things that we keep bumping up against that we don't notice in all the murkiness. But that was coming to me as you were speaking. I was like, oh wow, that's been a similar experience for you in some ways. Like you've given in the silence away time for the murkiness to settle, and then you can keep coming back to what you notice comes up, that you notice that is something you want to attend to throughout. So that's beautiful. Thank you. Really good. And is there anything you wanted to say about the internal versus the external noise?
I mean, this is going to be a very like use phrase because of COVID, but I do think that because of COVID we are more silent externally. Like we don't like have the same amount of like noise or like same amount of like things to do. We're like more kept to ourselves now because we have to. But that doesn't mean necessarily that we're more silent internally, because I think what Bethany referred to, like I think being more aware and intentional about silence and what's going on inside of you, I think that's a spiritual practice, not just not having noise, but working through what's going on inside. And I think retreats or just kind of like adopting it as a spiritual practice is what allows us to like analyze what's going on inside, which actually allows us to do like the inner work and like the difficult things that are going on in our life. So I agree that like it is really murky and it is like, I don't know, risky in a sense. It feels like very vulnerable to like step into that, because that's where like you know the hard things are coming up, like the thoughts that you like repressed, or like the your fears. Like I think everything bubbles up, and it takes like time and like courage to step into that. But that's where you also see like God the most, and when you feel His presence, because it is a lot to step into. But I think it's that awareness and intentionality of like sorting through that it's like really valuable.
How did you experience God's presence with you in the silence? And maybe that changed over the period of the longer you were in silence, because you guys were in silence for a few days. Like, I forget how many, but I remember they were there in silence for a while. These guys went full on into silence, which is awesome. It's really, really neat. Which is why I wanted them to be here to share with you, because they dove right into silence. And how did you experience God in that? Did it change over time, or what was that like for you?
Do you want? Yeah, I think, I mean, just to give some context on what it looked like we were in this beautiful place surrounded by nature, like no technology, no internet. So for me, it was like paradise. It was beautiful, especially like coming out of like a summer full of technology and communication and just busyness. I think as the days progressed, at first, obviously, it was difficult to like kind of like sit down and like deal with everything at once, like all the thoughts and like all the things that I was like ignoring or not paying attention to. But as like the days went by, I did feel like I was able to like identify things. And I remember that you suggested that we don't kind of like judge ourselves so much, but kind of like let like things come by and kind of like give them up to God. So like whenever things came by, I was just trying to have like a more natural conversation with God. And I kind of like felt more and more like I could have that closeness to Him, that I could bring Him all these different things and not be so scared of also like acknowledging that they were happening, right? Like a negative thought or something, I would just bring it up to God and kind of like work through that a little bit more instead of just like repressing it or like ignoring it. So in a sense, like I think it did bring me closer to God, and I can feel that even this semester too, as like I feel there's like a lot going on in my head. I can speak to God more regularly and like have that closeness of relationship. And I also remember how you suggested that like prayer is not just like this ritual that we do, like it's also a conversation with God, right? Like on our daily activities. So I think that's something that I learned to do throughout the retreat, was just talking to God constantly.
Oh, cool. Pray without ceasing, and it just kind of happened. Very cool. Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. How about yourself, Bethany?
I think it was interesting, because I think you had kept using this phrase of like a deepening silence, because we would pause kind of like for a check-in in the evening, and and I think in those, then like after that we would like read some scripture and pray, and then go back into silence. You had like kept using that phrase of like a deepening silence, which was interesting, of like for me experiencing like on the first day, the first really like 24 hours, I think I was like really frustrated at myself that I couldn't like just be more like still, and that I was like frustrated that my mind was so like busy, and that there was so much like noise and distraction, and so I think like I think something that is interesting in silence is I think you become more aware of like who you are and not who you are like presently and not really who you are wanting to be, because I think when you're so distracted it's easy to almost like have an ideal picture of yourself in your mind, but they're like, so in silence I think God gives you that space to both like show you who you are but also like show you more how he's working and what he's doing in your life, and I think really like who you are in light of him. And so I think like, yeah, for me that was like the first day was that like frustration of experiencing like all of that distraction, and then moving into more like really craving a like sense of peace that I knew like God like wanted me to experience, but I like had kept myself from doing that. And so I think like, yeah, I think moving into like a deeper silence, starting to like process through some of those things that I had been distracting myself from was like, I think God kind of working through me in that sense of like showing me more like who I am in light of him, and then also like the peace that he has to give me. And I remember we had a conversation about like a frustration over like feelings of like maybe like not necessarily bearing fruit in a season. And then we were like talking about this concept of like how fruit trees like go through hard winters, and they have to do that for like 5 to 7 years before they bear good fruit. And so seeing that is like a slow work, but just because there's like a slow work doesn't mean that it's not work, you know? And so I think just in silence there's room for like allowing God to start showing you like what is he doing in your life and how is he working. And when you, at least for me, like when I'm so easily distracted by everything else, if I'm not stopping, I'm not like really seeing that. So yeah, I think that was kind of more my experience.
That long, slow work of God is so important during this time, isn't it? Like everything seems to happen really fast in COVID, but nothing happens fast in COVID. It's like this combination of flurry, but slow, like winter, like underneath. So wow, that's a beautiful image. I remember that on your retreat, and it still strikes me when I hear you speak it as powerful. If there are students who, so I'm thinking of two different types of retreats. There's kind of one that's almost like, I've been struck by this has been a thought that's gone through my head since people started coming back in quarantine, and that is that people who have to go into quarantine and in self-isolation are in a sense forced into a silent retreat that they never intended, that they never asked for, that they were never equipped for. If people who are in their apartments and in this place of isolation, are there ways that you would recommend from your own experience of being in silence? I know you went away, but are there experiences for people that could help them maybe enter into intentional retreat, into silence in their apartments in this time in a way that might be life-giving, not just kind of forced, have to be there, but a way of entering into that in a life-giving way, or something that is, I don't know. Anyway, I don't really have an ending to that, but something that is life-giving. I don't know. What do you guys think? I just wonder.
It's a great perspective, honestly. Like, I hadn't made the connection, but that's so true. Like, I'm going home for Christmas and then coming back, so I'll have to do quarantine. So I'm actually kind of looking forward to that. People are like, you're crazy. I'm a little bit crazy. But at the same time, I won't have homework or all these different things. And like something that happened on the retreat is I slept a lot. I was really tired physically, like, to be honest, like just like feeling rested was like one of the highlights of feeling like physically restored, but also spiritually restored. So I would say that like what I will do in my quarantine is just like make sure that I'm resting enough in that way I'll have energy to dive more into like spiritual things, because I think they do take their toll. Like they consume energy, right?
Yeah.
Something that I really enjoyed during the retreat is I started reading The Prodigal Son, like the book by Henry Nouwen. So I feel like it was, you did like, it was the advice, like don't feel like you have to read or be productive, but if you feel led to something, then definitely do. And I feel like some of the ways that I connect with God is like learning more about Him, or like feeding myself with like new ways I can connect with Him. So I think that book really like helped me, because I had the time, I had the mental space, I felt rested to like dive into something like deep and getting to know Him better. So my biggest recommendations, I guess, would be to get enough like rest, and not just like rest of like Netflix and like, you know, Instagram, but actual like rest of like sleep and maybe like exercise or like good food. And then yeah, maybe there is something that you've been putting off about like learning about God. Like maybe it's like a book, or maybe it's like a worship song, or like something that connects you to God, and like dive deep into that. Yeah, I journaled a lot too, which was really helpful as well to kind of like sort my thoughts. And I'm a very like thinking person, so putting things in paper helps me process them as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Those are some great tips. Sleeping well. It's the sleeping well and listening to your body. And you named so many embodied things. So many ways of entering into silence with our bodies. And there is something about bringing our bodies into our practice of silence that is somehow important, that we don't become disembodied, kind of floating out there in some inner silence that is detached, but that our bodies are engaged with good food, good sleep, exercise.
Yeah, you feel renewed, and I think that's one of the things that you've been mentioning a lot since I met you, and more like this summer and through COVID, that our technology kind of like drives us to think we're disembodied. Like we live in Zoom, we live in these platforms, and we are not in so much connection with our bodies anymore, because we're forced to be in these like mediums. So I see like retreats or like even the quarantine as a opportunity to step away from that and kind of go back to your roots, and like remember that you are a body that has like needs and limitations, so weaknesses, and like that's something like beautiful, because that's how God created us, right? So it's like an opportunity to step away from that, because we won't have homework, hopefully, or responsibility. So it's a time to reconnect with yourself and your needs, and or take things slowly. Like I remember you said that it's really good during like silent retreats to like even like smell your food and like you know, savor everything. And I remember I made this really cool omelet when we were there. It was the best one I've ever made. And just like savoring it and like taking my sweet time eating that.
Awesome.
Like watching like the forest or something. So in the same way, just taking things slowly has like an added beauty that we don't get to enjoy, especially during the semester when things get really crazy and you forget to eat, or you eat super quickly. Like it's in the simple things that we can find so much like joy and reconnection.
Wow. It's in the simple things we can find such joy and reconnection. Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I just wonder, for people who are new to silence and want to figure out a way in, so they could do these things in their apartments. But is there any way you would suggest they kind of get started in silence, or how would you suggest they begin?
Yeah, I would say start small. I think you can be like really ambitious, but yeah, I think like even starting with like a regular practice of like spending like 2 minutes in silence and then work to 5 and then 10 and like do that in bite-sized chunks, because I think I think that it can be kind of like shocking to your system, especially if you are like someone who's constantly surrounded by people or noise or whatever. I think that it can be like almost overwhelming to go into long periods of silence. So I would say like if you're really interested in like starting to practice silence, that you do it in little bite-sized pieces first, and then you can work that up to a longer period. But I think, yeah, like have grace for yourself in that too. And I think similar to like what Dany was saying is that I think we are made to rest, and I think like silence is one of the ways that we can learn how to actually rest. So I would say it is like a very important and very valuable thing to practice, but have grace for yourself in that and start like quite small.
Yeah, even leaving some moments before prayer, like just like a minute before you start just like talking. I think that centers you and like where you are. Or I've heard friends who in their car rides like don't listen to like the radio or music, and they just like use that time to be in silence, right? Or there are many different ways, like going on walks. And I think Christmas break is a great opportunity to try it out for longer periods if you're comfortable, like maybe a morning off, right? You just take it and like do your devotional and maybe just like sit in that and like have coffee and tea and not do much. So I think you can do both, and I think the small ones are powerful as well.
I hear like I'm making space for silence, like kind of maybe not just diving into silence, but starting to just make space in all sorts of ways to open up silence, opportunity, and then growing in that, but making space for it. As we gather today, it's the first week of Advent, and so I set the table with this little Advent wreath. So we've lit the Christ candle in the center, and then one of these candles would be lit as the candle of hope for this week. But silence fills the Christmas story. It's kind of throughout, with Zechariah's enforced silence, but then thinking of all the times Mary and others are on journeys, often by themselves, and wondering how maybe silence could play a part in our own inner preparation for Christmas. I wonder if there are ways, like you suggest, as we go back to our homes and enter into this, like we get almost a month, I guess, like this extended time, much of it in quarantine. Are there ways that you could see silence being a participant in our preparations for Christmas? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think the semester right now is like really busy. It's gonna be super busy with papers and like due dates and all of that. So I think we're all like, oh, well, I'm gonna finish this final and everything will be fine, right? It'll be like like an end goal and everything will be different. But I think if we start thinking about Christmas now and kind of like savoring that like anticipation of Christmas and like looking forward to that, and whether that's like silence or just remembrance or being more intentional about those kinds of thoughts of like there is rest also in the here and the now, like there is hope even in the midst of like craziness and chaos. I think that's really like hopeful, and I think that's one of the core things about Advent, right? Is like we are in anticipation of Christmas. And I guess with going home, like everyone's home is different, right? There's homes that are very quiet, others that are not so quiet. So it's just like finding what works like best for you, and what does like silence and Advent look like for you. I'm sure it's going to look different for different people. Like it might be just going on a walk once in a while during Christmas break, or it might look like taking like a few mornings or evenings off if you can, but still being like intentional and carving that time out, as you said.
Cool.
Yeah, and I think if you do live with a lot of people too, you can also tell them that like, hey, like this is something that I'm gonna try out, and I'm gonna spend like my morning in silence, and that way they can like also give you that space so you can do that. But I think that is like, because you had talked about that idea of like setting aside some mornings over Christmas break to spend in silence, like in preparation for Christmas, which I think is a really cool idea. But yeah, like letting the people you live with know that too, so that you can actually like do that without like having those external distractions too. But
invite your community to support you
Yeah.
in taking silence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and letting them know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Instead of, shh, don't bother me, I'm in silence. You can imagine a bunch of siblings having lots of fun with that.
Yeah, I mean, time is precious, right? And like,
Mhm.
it is a sacrifice sometimes to step away from like being with people, because I think people like give us this sense of security and affirmation that we're always looking for. But I think when we carve out time to like get that from God, it might be a little bit like nerve-wracking to do it, but we can reap the fruits of that time and that investment into the long run, into the year. And like, I think that really speaks to our core identity and to like the core need of love, and then we're better able to love others, because I do see that when I carve out time for silence or even for being with God in solitude, like I'm able to better love others and to be in community. And there's this essay by Henry Nouwen that says from like solitude to community to ministry.
Yes.
I love that essay, and I kind of read it sometimes to remind myself that it all starts from like the core from God, and then we're able to be in community better and serve others. So even if Christmas might not be a peaceful time for you, like, or it might be, carving out that time will help you be in community better and enjoy that time even better.
Yeah, I love that. And although we don't have much opportunity to be together in community in silence, I wonder, just with our last like couple minutes, how, if there are people who want to practice silence together, because you two were in silence together, what does that look like to be in silence in a community, in community?
Yeah, I think it does start with like you as a community, you're like setting your intentions of like, this is what you're wanting to do, and you kind of agree on that together too, because it's really not going to work well if like if Dany was like, I'm gonna like spend this like 48 hours in silence, I was like, okay, great, but I'm like gonna like come and talk to you. Yeah, so like really, like inviting your community into that with you. But I think like, like giving each other space, and we didn't even like really like even look at each other for that period of like, if someone was in the kitchen, like I would like sit in the living room and wait till like the kitchen was free, and so like giving each other physical space as well, but then really like I think cherishing too like our moments when we had agreed to like break silence and like talk together. And I think coming out of silence too, we didn't feel a need to always talk, but I feel like our conversations were definitely more enriching after spending so much time in silence. I don't know what else you want to add.
Yeah, I would just add that it's like a beautiful thing to be in community and to be with someone else and not feel the space with like conversation all the time. To just be with other people is like nice and rewarding, and I do feel like our friendship grew closer because we have this like lived experience together when we were able to share with each other like what silence was doing within us. So just sharing that has a lot of value.
And I think having someone else to like, when you're later like processing that experience and like processing all of that like inner work stuff that was happening, like sharing that with somebody else who was also going through that same thing, because it is kind of like a strange concept to tell other people like, oh, like I went and I did this, and they don't, if they haven't done that, they don't really get what you've experienced. So having somebody else that you can like share that with, and then also like start processing to like all the things that like God has started doing in you that you don't quite understand, and like sharing that with someone, I think is really beautiful.
Wow, that's really neat. Yeah, I was really blessed by your time of silence at the Hermitage too. I know it deepened and enriched my experience of God, and and just was blessed by getting to know the two of you a little bit in that time. So and thank you so much for joining us here today. If there's, I wonder, as we conclude, as there would be, as people enter into this practice, would there be a word of blessing that you would give each, like that you would, a blessing of something as people enter this journey. Is there a word of blessing that you would speak from your own experience?
I would say that may God give you the grace to accept what's in you and give you the courage to dive into that.
Oh, I like that. That's beautiful.
That was really good.
It was really good.
I don't know if I want to top it.
That's right. And on that note, I'm going to give a blessing too. But Dany, that was beautiful. It is true. That is a wonderful blessing. Yeah. I actually wonder, maybe we just hold that, because that echoes, I think, a lot of what I would wish to bless all of you with as well. So are you able to repeat that? Is that even possible? I can never remember what I said after I've said it. So
yes, obviously inspired by the Holy Spirit. I'm not a poet or anything. So may God give you the grace to accept what is in you and the courage to explore that, or the courage to dive into that.
So may this blessing rest upon you this Christmas season as you continue to enter into new ways of being with God and in prayer and in your community. Thank you for joining us. And I'm also, while I have a chance, thank you for the way that you are gifting this campus in many ways, spiritually, as well as the many wonderful practical ways you have supported students and this campus through this time. So deeply grateful for both of you, and thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you, Jen.
So, blessings on you too.
Thank you.
Go in peace.